Hello and welcome to the next of our full course lectures. This lecture is on social and environmental accounting. So we're really thinking here about the impact of the business on the environment. So the first area that we need to discuss here is sustainability. So what does sustainability mean? Well, sustainability means, can the business meet its present needs without compromising the future? So can it meet what it needs to do today without having a detrimental effect on how that business can perform in the future, or indeed a detrimental effect on society and the environment in the future? So really what we need to try and do, if we're going to try to be sustainable, is to provide the best outcomes, and that goes for both now and in the future. So we're not just considering what's happening at the present time, we're thinking about how that impacts on the future. So that's when we're thinking about both humans and the environment. So we're thinking about the impact on both humans and the environment. So how do we relate this then to corporations, to our businesses that we're looking at? Well, they may well provide a corporate social responsibility report. Now, we've talked about corporate social responsibility up to this point, but let's link that in with sustainability. So corporate social responsibility linked to sustainability means, are we providing sustainable business activities? And there are various ways within this corporate social responsibility report that we can show whether or not we're acting in a sustainable way. So that would include, first of all, full costing. So full costing would include environmental costs in the full costs of the business. Now that would include costs that aren't necessarily impacted on the business, but impacted on society as a whole. So we would include all costs, including environmental costs, in the costs in our business. And we'll look at that when we look at environmental accounting. We would also include the social impact of our activities, for example, social injustice or exploitation. So we need to assess that as a business and see if in any way our activities could be causing it. And we'll look at environmental issues. So we'll look at perhaps using non-renewables. That might be something we could change and use renewable sources, or indeed the damage that we're providing to the environment. So corporate social responsibility reports look at both of these activities, the sustainability and the environmental impact. So one of the key areas in sustainability is trying to measure it, and that can be very difficult. So there are two main approaches that we can take to getting a measurement of sustainability. First of all, we could go with a quotance approach. The quotance approach is where we compare the amount available with the usage of that resource. So how much of the resource is available and how much are we currently using? That will tell us if it's sustainable or not. So are we using an amount that is sustainable? So in that way, this method is quantifiable. So we can see whether what we're doing is sustainable or not. If it's not, well then we can modify our activity. That is as opposed to a subjective approach. Now, a subjective approach is where we measure the intentions of the firm. So the firm may have the intention to do something and it will express that. However, that is not quantifiable. So that's just measuring intentions. It's not quantified, so we're not putting a number on it. Therefore, it's going to be hard to measure the progress. So let's bring this all together now and look at illustration 1. So read through the scenario, get an idea of what's happening, maybe have a go at the question, and then learn from the answer working through it with me. The requirement in illustration 1 is to explain sustainability in the context of environmental auditing and criticise the finance director's understanding of sustainability. So we're going to look at environmental auditing throughout this session, but we're really concerned about sustainability here. So sustainability, remember, is the ability of the business to continue to exist and conduct operations with no effects on the environment that cannot be offset or made good in some other way. So the activities that we're carrying out, well, that shouldn't affect the environment in a detrimental way. We should be able to offset the effects that we have on the environment. So importantly, it refers to both the inputs and the outputs of the organisation. The resources must only be consumed at a rate at which they can be reproduced. and offset in some other way or not irreplaceably depleted. When it comes to the outputs, they shouldn't pollute the environment at a greater rate than can be cleared or offset. So recycling, that's one way to reduce the net impact of production on the environment. So that's what sustainability is. So we must take into consideration things like carbon emissions, pollution to water, the local environment, and use strategies to neutralise these impacts by engaging in environmental practices that will replenish the used resources and eliminate harmful effects of pollution. So when we're thinking about the finance director here, well, he's completely misunderstood the meaning of the term sustainable. He's assumed it refers to the sustainability of the business as a going concern and not of the business's place in the environment. So it's nothing to do with the business continuing, it's to do with their impact on the environment. So clearly the businesses last for 50 years, but that has no bearing on whether the business's environmental footprint is sustainable. And that's what's meant by sustainability in the context of environmental reporting. It's nothing to do with the going concern of the business. It's the impact of that business on the environment. The next thing that we need to understand here is that economic activity will lead to various things. Those various things will have an impact on the environment and on society, and indeed on the business themselves. So the first thing that economic activity will lead to is an environmental footprint. So what this actually means is that by undertaking economic activity, we obviously have a cost on the environment. So that cost to the environment could be through the use of the resources. So if we're a business, for example, a mining company, or indeed a logging company, well, they have a big impact on the environment through the use of the resources. Even, for example, a nuclear power plant will have an impact on the environment because it uses water to cool the reactor, and that may well lead to pollution. So the use of resources will lead to a cost in the environment through pollution or damage, for example, and we need to assess whether that is sustainable or not. So that ties into the sustainability that we've already talked about. So a business needs to understand what its environmental footprint is, and that will be specific to the type of business and the business that it carries out. So for example, we might have chemical usage or release of chemicals that will have an impact on the environment. Carbon release, almost every business has some form of carbon release through the use of energy. And indeed packaging, and trying to maybe reduce that packaging is something that a business can do to reduce its environmental footprint. So simply by having economic activity, you will have an environmental footprint. You will also have what's called a social footprint. So your social footprint will fall into three main areas. So that will be the social capital, so the usage of the social capital that you have, that's just how the business interacts with society as a whole. The human capital, well, that's the people that you have within the business. So how are you using those people? How are you making that sustainable? And indeed, constructed capital, the capital that you have built up through having that reputation as a business. So that's how your social footprint can impact on society, and the business needs to think about having sustainability in all three of these different areas. The last thing we need to consider here is that by undertaking economic activity, the business automatically will have environmental risks. Because it interacts with the environment, that will cause risks to the business. So these arise from the effect of the business on the environment. So for example, they could be strategic risks. It could, for example, be that you had a reputation risk. Maybe you were having a detrimental effect on the environment, and that may cause your reputation to be damaged. That is an example of an environmental risk. Or indeed, it could be operational. It could be that your effect on the environment affects your day-to-day operations. That could even be the fact that you're not using resources in a sustainable way and you're running short on resources to actually undertake your day-to-day activities. So however they come about, these are environmental risks, and they arise from the effect of the business on the environment. You can't get away from them. Simply by having economic activity, these risks will arise. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail through a scenario. So illustration 2, it's using the same scenario as illustration 1. So have a go at the question and then work through the answer with me. The requirement in illustration 2 is to define environmental risk, distinguish between strategic and operational risk, and explain why the environmental risks at JGB are strategic. So we need to do 3 things here. We've got to define it, we've got to distinguish between strategic and operational, and then explain why the environmental risks are strategic. So first of all, an environmental risk is an unrealised loss or liability arising from the effects on an organisation from the natural environment or the actions of that organisation upon the natural environment. So it's a loss or a liability created by the effect that we have on the environment. So it can therefore arise from natural phenomena such as climate change, adverse weather, resource depletion, threats to water or energy, or indeed emissions, pollutions, waste, or product liability. So lots of different areas that environmental risk can come up with. Now, strategic risks we need to talk about here. These are risks that arise from the overall strategic positioning of the company in its environment. Some strategic positions give rise to greater risk exposures than others. So some are strategic and some won't be strategic. Strategic risks typically affect the whole of an organisation and are not just one or more of its parts. So it affects the whole organisation, not just a little bit. Strategic risks can potentially involve, therefore, very high stakes. They can have very high hazards and very high returns. So we need to be aware of that. Because of this, they are managed at a board level, so the board concentrates on strategic risks and will form a key part of strategic management. Examples of strategic risks include those affecting products, markets, reputation, supply chain issues, and other factors that can affect the strategic positioning. For JGP, reputation risk in particular is likely to be the most far-reaching risk and hence one of the most strategic. So the link between the environmental and reputation risk we've talked about before. When it comes to operational risks, remember these refer to potential losses arising from the normal business operations. Accordingly, they affect day-to-day running of the operations and business systems, not strategic overall risks. So operational risks are managed at a risk management level, not necessarily the board level like strategic risks, and can be managed and mitigated by internal control systems. So they'll affect specific areas of the business. So examples would include risks that, whilst important and serious, affect one part of the organisation and not the whole, such as machinery breakdown, loss of data, injuries at work, building estates problems. Those sorts of problems are operational risks. Looking at JGP then, environmental risks are strategic because of the following. Firstly, environmental performance affects the way in which the company is viewed by some of its key stakeholders. The case mentions the local community and investors, so both of those are thinking about its environmental performance. So that means it's going to affect the whole business. So the threat of the withdrawal of support by the local community is clearly a threat, and that's capable of affecting the strategic positioning of JGP because its ability to attract key resource inputs, which is labour, would be threatened. So they want to have staff, they need staff to undertake their operations. If they don't have it through the community not wanting to work for them because they're concerned about their environmental performance, then that is a key strategic risk. In addition, the case mentions that a growing group of investors is concerned with environmental behaviour, and so this could have potential market consequences on the business, again, a strategic risk. As a chemical company also, we've said that JGP has a structural environmental risk, which means that its membership of the chemical industry makes it have a higher level of environmental risk than members of other industries. Because chemicals could escape, they could have an effect on the environment. That's a big environmental risk. So environmental risk arises from the potential losses from such things as emissions and hazardous leaks, also pollution and some resource consumption issues, sustainability as we mentioned previously. So the CEO has referred to this risk in his statement about the threat to JGP's overall reputation. All of that indicates that this is a strategic risk. Anything that affects the business overall will be a strategic risk. So we understand now what sustainability is and the effects that economic activity can have on the environment. How can we deal with these? Well, accounting for sustainability is something that the business can undertake. So bringing into account the effect that the business has on the environment. So that may include several different areas. For example, full cost accounting. So full cost accounting seeks to bring in all of the different costs from the impact that the business has in various different areas. So for example, we'll include all costs, whether they are economic. So that would be our usual definition of a cost. It would be financial or economic in some way. Also, we will bring in social costs. Now that may not up to this point have been recorded. Or indeed environmental costs. So environmental costs can be external costs. External costs would be to the environment, external to the business. Or indeed they could be internal costs, i.e. the cost of measuring the environmental impact or the cost of bringing a new system in. Sometimes external environmental costs are borne by society, not by the business themselves. So rather than society bearing that cost, we're going to bring it into the business. So we'll look at all costs, financial and non-financial, and we'll assign a cost to them. In that way, we're internalising all of the costs of the business, whether they're borne by the business or by society as a whole. So those environmental costs would be included in our income statement, and therefore we would have full cost accounting. That relates to TBL accounting, which is triple bottom line accounting. So this is where we're not just looking at the financial reporting, we're expanding that. So we're not just looking at financial, we're going to include other performance criteria. So broadly speaking, TBL looks at three areas. First of all, people. So what effect does the business have on people? So for example, the impact of the business on stakeholders. That would be assessed in the reporting. Also, the impact on the community would be reported upon. So as you can see, we're not just thinking about financial performance, we're thinking about the impact of the business on other areas. Not only would we be looking at the impact on people, we'd be looking at the impact on planet. So that would be the impact on the environment, thinking about that environmental footprint that we've already talked about, and also thinking about the sustainability that we mentioned at the start of this session. Lastly, we would then think about profit. So we would try to get a balance on our profit between the people and the planet. So triple bottom line looks at all three of those areas and reports on each. The people, the impact on the stakeholders, the planet, the impact on the environment and the sustainability, and lastly profit, the balance that we have as a business between the people and the planet. So in that way, what the business can do is try to take more account of what they're actually impacting upon and what the impact of their business is on the environment and on society as a whole. Also, we can think about managing social and environmental risk. So for example, we might have EMAS, and that's our Eco Management and Audit Scheme. So what this is a voluntary scheme, and it's to try and improve the environmental performance of businesses. So it involves having an environmental statement, and that environmental statement is audited. So it's checked to see that you're actually complying with it. So this requires us to implement an environmental management system. So within the business, we have an environmental management system, and that system is audited to ensure that we're complying with the environmental statement that we've made. So there'll be various elements to this Eco Management and Audit Scheme. First of all, legal. Are we meeting our legal requirements in an environmental sense? Well, of course the business should be doing that, and when they're audited, we'll find out whether they are. Are we reporting? So that means disclosure of information to stakeholders. So letting stakeholders know about the environmental and social impact of the business. Also, environment. So could we do better when it comes to our impact on the environment? And lastly, the employees. Are the employees involved in understanding what the business's impact is on the environment and how we're seeking to improve that impact on the environment? So all of those elements will form our environmental management system. We'll have made an environmental statement to say how we see the organisation fitting within the environment, and all of this will be audited to make sure that we're attaining those standards. And we'll talk about environmental auditing shortly. Lastly, we have ISO 14000. So this is our standards for environmental management. So these are voluntary again, but we can choose to implement them. So this involves having internal systems for better environmental performance. Now again, if we're going to have those internal systems, those must be audited to meet those requirements. The audit must show that we're meeting all of the requirements under ISO 14000. If we are, well then we can get accreditation for that and say to our stakeholders, look, we've actually implemented the requirements. So the last area I want to consider here is that environmental audit that we've mentioned. So we're thinking not just environmental but social. So social and environmental auditing. I'm going to look at each in turn. First of all, social auditing. So what we might do is we might undertake a social audit to see if we are achieving our objectives. So we'll have set some objectives for our impact on society, and we can audit those to see did we actually achieve them. So this will take both an internal and an external view, and the areas that we'll seek to cover will be first of all our impact on our employees, how we treat them, how well we do that, and how we impact upon them. The environment, well, we know now the environmental footprint is very important, and how we undertake our interaction with the environment will feed into this. Lastly, community. So what we can do with our social audit is see if we're achieving the objectives that we've set for ourselves in these particular areas. When it comes to specifically environmental auditing, we'll be thinking about the impact of the company on the environment. For example, if we've committed to implement ISO 14000, have we actually done it? So that, remember, needs to be audited. So the sort of categories we'd be looking at is the waste management of the business, emissions of the business to see if they're within legal limits or within the limits that the company has set for themselves. Water consumption is now becoming more important. Energy consumption is always important. And ultimately, the impact of the business on the environment is the thing we need to consider here. So how do we actually undertake a social or an environmental audit? Well, the procedure to do it, we know what we're looking for. We're seeing if objectives have been achieved. Have we implemented what we said we were going to? But to check whether that has happened, we need to first of all agree the metrics. So that's not always easy. Remember we said that when we're measuring sustainability or environmental performance, we can use either the quotient approach or the subjective approach. Well, in order to have metrics, we're probably going to have to try to use the quotient approach to put a quantity upon what we're trying to achieve. So we agree the metrics, i.e. what we're trying to achieve. Then we can audit them to measure our performance. So did we actually achieve those metrics? What was the variance that there was? Lastly, we'll report the compliance with the metrics or the variance against them. So it'll depend on what particular area you're looking at, but an environmental audit will first of all need some metrics to assess performance. So those will hopefully be quantifiable so we can put a number on it. That makes it easier to measure our performance against those metrics. Lastly then, we report our compliance. Have we actually complied with what we were trying to do, or is there a variance involved? So let's look at this in detail in illustration 3. Again, we're using the same scenario for the last two illustrations. So have a look at this, have a go at it, and then work through the answer with me. Illustration 3 asks us to explain the 3 stages in an environmental audit and explore, using information from the case, the issues that JGP will have in developing these stages. So we should know now what the 3 stages are. Let's start with the first of them, and that is to agree and establish the metrics. So this selection is important because it will determine what will be measured against, how costly the audit will be, and how likely it is that the company will be criticised for window dressing or greenwashing, i.e. showing things that they haven't done. So what we need to see here is, how are we going to measure how the business has actually performed? JGP in particular, for example, needs to decide whether to include supply chain metrics, which would be a much more challenging audit. Given the board's preference that it's to be as thorough as possible, it seems likely that they'll include a wide range of measures and set relatively ambitious targets against those measures, because if it's going to be as thorough as possible, we need to get that spread and we need to understand what's actually happening. So that's agreeing and establishing the metrics. The next bit is to measure against those metrics. So we're going to look at the actual performance and we're going to see how they performed against the metrics that we've set. So the means of measurement will usually depend upon the metrics being measured. Whilst many items will be capable of numerical measurement, others, such as public perception, will be less so. So remember, we saw that distinction in the lecture. We want to see if we can quantify some of these aspects. Some of them we can't, however. So given the board's stated aim of providing a robust audit and its need to demonstrate compliance, this stage is of great importance. So if JGP wants to demonstrate compliance, then measures must be established so that compliance against target can clearly be shown. This is likely to favour a quantitative measure, so we want to try and put some numbers against these metrics so that we can say, well, look, did we actually achieve what we set out to achieve? So the last step is to report the levels of compliance or variance. So the issue here is how to report the information and how widely to distribute the report. The board's stated aim is to provide as much information as possible in the interests of transparency, and that's good from a corporate governance point of view. So this would tend to signal the publication of the public document, although there will be issues on how to produce the report and at what level to structure it. So we'll put it into the public, but we need to be careful about how we do that. So given that it was the desire to issue an environmental report that underpins the proposed environmental audit, it's likely that JGP will opt for a high level of disclosure to offset the concerns of the local community and the growing number of concerned investors. So they'll decide to report probably on quite a wide basis to allay those fears. That then was our lecture on social and environmental accounting. Make sure that you're aware of all of the terms involved here and the steps in an environmental audit.